Right. I guess what I want to talk about is something that has really obsessed me for a lot longer than you have been alive, each of you, as it were. And economics is a very hard subject, and it's hard also to keep your mind clean, because all sorts of prejudices come in the way. I mean, it's an inevitable feature of being alive. And one wants to distill in such a way to allow yourself to have your prejudices and eat it as well, if you see what I mean. That is to say, without some motivation, it's pointless doing economics. There are many other equally interesting things to do. On the other hand, if the motivation gets in your way of thinking through problems in a way which you can convincingly explain to your spouse or your children, or in your case, your parents, without feeling embarrassed, then there's something wrong. I want to use this lecture, the Measuring the Wealth of Nations, in some sense, as a way of crystallizing something that has puzzled me for a long time. And the basic theorems on which I will be building this account are phenomenally easy to prove. There's something, it's embarrassing. You can't even spend a page proving it. It sort of rolls out in a couple of sentences, lines. Certainly in the first paper that I published on this subject with Professor Carl-Johan Mailer at the Stockholm School of Economics, and subsequently the Baer Institute of Ecological Economics, we were embarrassed that how could we publish a paper where the theorem is so easy to prove? The trick wasn't the proof. The proof simply rolled out. The trick which prevented, I like to think, economists from finding it, discovering it over the decades, was not formulating the problem in the right way. Once you do that, then the thing just comes out very quickly. Notice I've talked about the wealth of nations, and you might say, well, what's new? The subject began with the book called The Wealth of Nations. The problem is, as you know, as those of you who are doing economics know, wealth basically has disappeared. We talk about income. We talk about life expectancy. We look about all the things that we care about. We use for making welfare judgments. And we sometimes think income is the same as wealth, but you know, even first-year students, certainly first-year students at Warwick will know, wealth and income are very different. Income is a flow, wealth is a stock. So immediately you have a serious problem. Question is, what are we doing with the wealth of nations, and why am I interested in it? Well, I'm not interested in it because one wants to construct yet another index with which to do welfare economics. I'll come to that in a few minutes as to what the questions are. I'm sort of working backwards in some sense. Some object like wealth, income, or some such index of describing an economy, index summarizing an economy, is typically the means to an end. So the UNDP, for example, makes a huge fuss about the fact that ends and means are different, and that we ought to be concerned with ends, not means. But Warwick students will know that if you understand the means well, that if you know what ends the means are means to, then it doesn't matter one bit as to whether you measure the means or whether you measure the ends. They will be both pointing in the same direction. Okay? So the question then is, why might you be interested in the means? So I mean, this is the prelude to saying that the UNDP gets it wrong. It's not that, well, means or ends are the same thing. It's just that if you need some kind of an index, some kind of a criterion by which you can make evaluative judgments, then it doesn't really matter. What you really need to do is to get the right means to further the ends. Okay? I'll be arguing, I'll be using the theorem which says that the right means is in fact a measure of wealth. That's the basic theorem, and I'll be working around it. So the question is, what am I asking for? What questions am I asking? I want you to think that even if you're a banker, I like to think that even bankers, on the odd moment, think like a citizen. So, we all do. We all spend most of our lives, thinking about ourselves, our nearest friends, closest relatives, and so forth, because otherwise life would be intolerable. You cannot think about the world all the time. It's not only inefficient, it's impossible. Just as you can't love everybody. It's a fatuous remark that you're in love with humanity. That's belittling the word. You can love only a few people. Spouse, children, parents, grandchildren, friends, of course, but a limited number of them. You can't sort of extend it to. But from time to time, each day, we do act as citizens. When we read the newspaper, we react as a citizen. Most of us do, some of the time. We think about the world at large, and the world could be our own economy, our community, of course, not be the whole universe, the whole world, but it's beyond ourselves. It's hard otherwise to explain why reasonably wealthy people like ourselves perhaps vote for progressive income taxes. It's not quite in our interest, but we do that. So from time to time we act on that, and it's in that spirit I want to talk about. I want to give today's lecture. So I want to think about us as citizens, all right? And we want to build our conception of the good, the social good, if you like, on the basis of individual goods. That's going to be my building block. You could bring in other features, of course. That's not ruled out. The great advantage of doing mathematics, as I tend to do, is the theorem actually spells out exactly the limits of your result. And the way I'm going to cast the result, I won't prove it, by the way, even though it's simple. This is not the occasion. This is after dinner. This is not the right time to do it, but I'll sort of lead you to the theorem and then work with it and give you some illustration with India as a database. It's that you need, first of all, to limit the notion of what you mean by the group that you're concerned with. There are 6 questions we tend to ask. Here they are. When we act as citizens, we think as citizens. I'm talking about economic evaluation involves 6 questions regarding the economy. I want to make it quite clear now. The economy is any unit that you care to think about. It could be a person, it could be your household. You could be saying, how is my household doing? How's my family doing? That's absolutely legitimate. It could be your community, it could be your city, it could be your state, it could be nation, and the data seems to be on the whole most available in the context of nation. So at the end I'll give you some data on India as a unit. Of course, sometimes we even think about the world as a whole. Say, how is the world doing? Terrible. That part is breaking apart, that part is doing well, and so forth, and so on. These are the issues that we think about. There are 6 questions. How has the economy been doing? How has it been doing in recent years? What should the forecast of our economy be if policies evolve over time in the way we expect them to evolve? That's like a forecast. How is the economy likely to perform under alternative policies? What policies should we support? What would be an ideal set of policies? Now it's 6 which we tend to teach undergraduates. We optimize, maximize fx subject to x being in a set f or something like that. No, sorry. Maximize fx subject to x being in some set g. Okay. That's the optimization problem. I want to go well beyond that. If you do well for economics only with an optimization economy in mind, I sometimes feel, what's the point of doing economics at all? Because then you can't apply it anywhere, or at least most places. I like to think that there are citizens even in Nigeria. that there are people who are honest, who would like to do something, and it may be, albeit very small, because they're a small cog in a machine, but the project falls on their lap, or they want to assess the state of affairs. What language do we give that person? And that's what this lecture is about. So these are these 6 questions. Now, I want to break these questions, as you can see, it's a very natural thing to do, into 2 parts, 2 types of questions. 1 and 2 are really concerned with what we'd call assessment of an economy. How is the economy doing? How has it been doing? How is it likely to be doing? And in fact, that's what you get a great deal of at the back pages of the World Development Report or the Human Development Report. All the tables are really about questions 1 and 2. They give you rates of growth of this, that, and the other, improvements or deteriorations of this, that, and the other, and so forth over the past 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, and so on. Okay? And then there will be forecasts about how things are likely to be. That's 1 and 2. That's a very perfectly reasonable question to ask, because without that, you wouldn't know what policies you might wish to recommend. If you think things are going badly, whatever that means, we'll come to that, of course, then you need to think about perturbing the economy in some ways. And that's part of 5 and 6. 5 and 6 are really concerned with policy. They're saying, what will the economy look like if we perturb it somehow? And we need a way of assessing the change that takes place. Now, so policy analysis involves questions 5 and 6. Sustainability analysis involves questions 1 and 2. And questions 3 and 4 are essentially forecast. What do I use the word forecast? Well, we're thinking of a dynamic economy, obviously. We're not, we want to think of an economy moving through time. And the forecast is really the status quo in a dynamic economy. That's how things are going to be on the basis of our understanding of the political economy of the situation. That is the way societies evolve. They respond to deterioration in the quality of life or improvements in the quality of life. For instance, political courses, is the perturbation takes place at a moment in time. We choose a policy, impose a tax, a subsidy, choose a project. It's going to shift the economy slightly. If it's a small project, it's going to be a small shift. But sure as hell, it's going to be a shift. Without the project, the economy would veer this way. With the project, it's going to veer that way. Maybe a little bit different, but still a bit different. Question, is it worth undertaking it? So again, you're evaluating a perturbation. So these are 2 types of perturbations. Now here's the good news. It's the same perturbation. They're not different in the sense you don't need 2 different criteria for answering them. So that's the first theorem. All right. Because you're so often concerned with policy, I'll be thinking in terms of sustainability, but and that's what I will do in the context of the case study that some of us undertook over the Indian economy. Among other economies, there were 5 economies we studied. One of them was Indian, and since I come from there, I have a prerogative. If Kenneth Arrow, who was one of the co-authors, was doing it, it would be the American economy, and one of our authors was from Venezuela, so he would have done the Venezuelan economy. Now, here's the theorem. We are interested in the ends of life, as it were. And I want you to think about the ends in a very general way. You could be a utilitarian, you could be a contractarian, you could be a Buddhist. Doesn't matter, but you have some notion of what constitutes a good life or the well-being of people, not only today, but you want to care about tomorrow, day after, and so forth into the future. Okay? Since you're economists at Warwick, the most natural way of thinking of it as an integral of utilities over time. That's fine. You're allowed to do that as well. And that's allowed. That's included. But it need not be. It could be any conception of the ends of life which you care about, the things that you care about, given the economy that you are studying. Okay? Those are the ends. The question is there an indicator, index, which summarizes the means to those ends, which have the following property, that when a perturbation increases that index, it also increases, and in fact, if and only if kind of statement, if and only if it improves your judgment about the ends that you care about. Okay? Maybe the sum total of utilities, or whatever. That's the question. And it should be an if and only if statement. Because, a question. Because, the statement should be of that kind because you want an equivalence between the ends and the means. Otherwise, you'd be losing if you just care about the means. And the strongest criticism that you can lay against all these ad hoc indicators that have been floating around and influencing your views about how the world works lies in the fact that there was no such theorem that they used. That's why theory is so important and why economics is so important. You can't just keep on inventing arbitrary indicators just because you think that it looks good. It's like the Human Development Index or some other index. Because you say, well, life expectancy is important, so let's include that. Education is important, let's include that. Well, of course, income is important too, so let's include that. And let's put them together and call it the Human Development Index and see how it moves. The problem with it is you need a theorem first. You want to show that that corresponds to the things that you really care about. Of course, each of these you do care about, but there are many other things you care about. Like perhaps ensuring that society doesn't fall apart in 50 years' time because of climate change. That doesn't come up in the Human Development Index because nature doesn't appear there. So you need to be really very careful and see how to write down the ends first, then an understanding of the way the world works so that you have some notion of the means to those ends and then bring them together. Okay, so that's basically the setup. Now, I'm going to cut short quite a bit now, because otherwise we could go on for a long time. The intuition is the following. In static economies, which is the one which most welfare economists study, Samuelson, Hicks, many others, national income was seen as the means. And the theorem that it went something like this. It works something like the following. You're looking at an optimizing economy. Now, you're all students here, so you can just close your eyes and imagine. You've got a production possibility frontier, and you've got a social indifference curve, okay? I mean, you can see the way my arms are bending, so you can almost visualize this thing that you're brought up on. And there's a tangency. Take the slope. Gives you relative prices, shadow prices, of course. They are not market prices. Now, at those constant shadow prices, shift the economy a little bit, tiny bit. Well, then it's moving the same way, the means and ends. The problem, that's a classic theorem. The problem with it is the following. It presupposes a stationary economy. Now, in a stationary economy, it doesn't matter whether you look at stocks or whether you look at flows, because one is proportional to the other. The moment you have a dynamic economy, i.e. an economy which is actually truly moving through time, you can't make that hypothesis, particularly given that you've got a finite Earth out here, and perhaps a reasonably unbounded set of ideas floating around so that, human capital can grow as much as you like. So you can't possibly use that theorem for anything worthwhile. But you can see the whiff of it. So I'm sort of cutting through the theorem, basically to say that if in a dynamic economy, wealth is the dynamic counterpart of a theorem that you are familiar with. It needs proof, it needs work, but it can be done, and it's been done. So what does wealth do? Wealth is the social value of all the capital assets in the economy. Now, that seems reasonable. That's a reasonable way of thinking about it. Why? Because capital assets are the basis on which things are possible. So if you know your stocks today, and you have a sense of the socio-political world, and the natural world, so how it moves, that you've got a forecast, you know how the accumulation or decumulation process is going to take place given the stocks that you have. Behavioral assumptions are required also, of course. The whole works. You need a model of the economy, okay? A dynamic model of the economy. You start with a bunch of capital assets, and your forecast is based on those capital assets that you've that you inherited. That's what forecasts do. However, good forecasts do something much more. Otherwise, it could be just a guess. If the forecast is based on some notion of an understanding of the way the world works, then you should be able to forecast what the world would be like in the future, even if the capital stocks today were different. You need to be able to handle counterfactuals, because if you don't, you haven't a theory. It's just arbitrary. Okay? So now you can see where I'm heading. Counterfactuals means you've got a stock of capital assets today. I'll come to what they are, by the way, but it's something like the productive capacity of the economy, like the productive capacity of your household. How many of you are there? What are their age? What's their education? And so forth. How much property do you own? And so forth. Okay? And if you're really smart, you would say, now my brother has just graduated from Warwick, and he's got an income stream ahead of him. So let's compute his human capital. The present discounted value of the flow of his potential earnings will be huge, and so forth. All right? So you can see where I'm heading. You really need to do something like, come up with something like the productive capacity of the economy, which I'm going to call wealth. It's the value of all the capital assets in the economy, and I'll be making that clear in a minute. Okay? Now, the reason I harped on the fact that you need to have counterfactuals in mind is you want to be able to ask the following question. You want to do two things, by the way. I'm sorry. This is one very important thing. I want to move away from question 6 because I want to be able to give an honest an architecture, a mental architecture to a person, maybe even in Afghanistan. But the occasional project comes his way and he may be able to push it through as an honest person. And he cares about his fellow citizens. Okay? Well, you need to give him a language. So I do not want to assume that the economy is optimizing. Absolutely not. The forecast will not be typically of an optimizing forecast. It will be a forecast with it may be with corrupt bankers, corrupt politicians, civil war going on. Nevertheless, you should be able to do welfare economics. If you can't, then don't do it. Okay? So this theorem is robust against that. Now, why do I need counterfactuals? Because I want to ask the following question. Given my forecast, given how I think the world works, I being the citizen, the person who is thinking through at breakfast table, what would be the worth of an additional unit of a particular capital asset if it were to come, if God were to give it to me free, given the ends that I care about? The answer to that is what we call a shadow price. That's why we need counterfactuals. If you think about shadow prices, you take partial derivatives of the valuation thing with respect to whatever else it is. But that's a perturbation. So you are doing counterfactuals there. All right, so that's how it is. That's the setup. Now, I talked about productive capacity. There are several ways, number of ways of going about it. They're all equivalent. That needs proof, but I can prove it. So that's all right. And when I say I prove it, it is published in referee journals, so I'm not, remember, you're students, so you mustn't take somebody's word for it, because it could be the theorem is false. It hasn't been proved to be false yet. So there are several ways of breaking up the productive capacity. I've chosen to do it this way because it's the easiest way to handle it, both conceptually and empirically. Produced capital, I want to break the productive capacity of an economy into two parts, produced capital and the social environment. Produced capital is the standard fare of growth models. manufactured capital, roads, buildings, machinery, and equipment. Human capital, and I don't need to elaborate on that, you're familiar with this idea, is the capital embodied in each of us. Okay? I want to include health, because typically in America, human capital is interpreted in terms of knowledge and skills. But health, I mean, if you're extremely unhealthy, but you've got a lot of knowledge, typically it won't be very useful, and vice versa. So those are, and there are ways of trying to estimate those. And then natural capital, I don't need to belabor it, but it's the reason I started working on this many years ago, this area. Now, these days, of course, we think of capital assets as anything which is durable. We talk about religious capital, social capital, institutional capital, and so forth, and that's fine. There's nothing wrong with them. There are, in some sense, they're certainly assets. I mean, they may not have much value. They could be dysfunctional, in which case it will be negative shadow price, goes without saying. But the question is, how do you handle it? I'm keeping it separate because I want it to be thought of as the social environment in which the produced capital gets allocated. That's the metaphor that I want to use. And where it works, where it has its bite, is in your forecast. When you forecast that you've got this much of produced capital, you've got that much of human capital, you've got that much of natural capital in the economy at this moment, 2015, what's the forecast of the world of this economy? Well, you will be asking, what are the institutions like? Is there a civil war going on at the moment? What's the chance that there will be a peace accord? And so forth. Do communities manage to do things when the government fails? All those questions are terribly important when you have a forecast. And that's embedded in the second class of productive class capital. Okay? So now you can see where I'm heading. The shadow prices of 1, 2, and 3 of produced capital will depend on the workings of your social environment. This lectern in a lousy country will be worth nothing. It's worth something here because, well, at least people think it's worth something here because you can hear a lecture. Maybe it's not much good, but it's still there. But you see what I'm getting at. The way 1, 2, and 3 are allocated does depend on 1, 2, 3, and 4 in the social environment. Maybe I will skip over time. You might be wondering what time is doing there, but when we come to it, we'll come to it. Okay, so that's the basic structure of our. So here the theorem. It says no matter what your ends are, there is a index of the means, which I'm going to call wealth, which is the social value, worth of 1, 2, and 3 of produced capital. And those shadow prices of those will depend, among other things, on the social environment, such that, correcting for population change and distribution and so forth, which I'll just ignore for the moment, I'll come back to it in a few minutes, corresponds to social well-being, your conception of the good. So the means, and so the theorem says that wealth adjusted for population and distribution is the right means, index of the means to the ends that you care about. And if your political philosophy, your notion of social good differs from your notion of social good, they will find expression where? In the shadow prices of the assets. So your shadow prices depend not only on the amounts of produced capital you have, the workings of the social environment, but also on your social values. And in fact, that's exactly what we do daily. When you sit over a beer or have coffee and argue with your friend about how things ought to be, part of it reflects your differences in values. Part of it, and a great deal of it, is founded on your different perception of the way the world works. And if you screen your debates, you'll find that both are at play. And they will find their reflection at shadow prices. So one thing is very important to recognize. Market prices are hard pieces of information. That's why the economist loves them. But Shadow prices are soft. You can debate shadow prices. You can quarrel about them because they're reflecting your things that you really care about. Okay? So that's the setup. Now I'm going to end by giving you, from the sublime to the ridiculous, you need to put numbers, otherwise what's the point of doing theory? So some years ago, when we proved some of these theorems, this was many years ago actually, now it's going back to 15 years, three of us, Goulder, Arrow, and myself, got Kevin Mumford and Kirsten Olsen, who were graduate students at that time, to do some number crunching with this framework. Now, of course, the leap from theory to empirics is inevitably treacherous. And you sort of, at the end of the day, at least certainly initially, I used to feel very dishonest after a day's work. The things that I've skipped in estimating and so forth. Until Professor Arrow once explained to me, he said, do you know what Kuznets must have felt when he was doing his great work in the 30s, estimating national income? He was making horrendous assumptions. I mean, you could tear them apart. It's not, so I won't really apologize, except that I will apologize. This is all very crude. But one reason it's crude, all this is crude, is that economics has not been taken seriously by economists and political leaders. National accounts are totally orthogonal to what I've been talking about. National accounts are not on stocks, they're all on flows, consumption, investment, and so forth, which has a very good reason. They were formulated, the schemata for national accounts, which Kuznets, Richard Stone, James Mead, giants of our subject, they were responding to the Great Depression. When the idle employment was sadly unfilled, 25% unemployment, you needed indicators to describe the activity, economic activity, something I called activity. So you needed to have an indicator which would give some muscle to policy for removing that scourge. But those were short-run problems. Somehow, after the war, when long-term growth, long-term economic development, if you like, growth is not the right word here, development became something of an area of importance, a problem of importance, those indicators got used. And today, it is, I mean, we economists may not say it, but no, we do. My macroeconomics friends are always talking about, you know, how do you jack up growth? Of what? Nobody has to say what growth of what. We know what they mean, the GDP. So it's a sort of unspoken indicator. And the question is, why? And so the database for wealth calculations is now woefully inadequate. If you start with the most difficult ones, countries don't even have estimates of stocks of natural capital. They will have forest cover maybe now, because you have the system which gives you forest cover free of charge pretty much these days. But anything detailed like wetlands, ponds, coral reefs, mangroves, these are tremendously important assets. I mean, lives depend on it. And if you worry about development, poverty, and so forth, to ignore that is just a travesty, because the poorest live on it on a daily basis. That's natural capital. So if you want to study if the economy is not the nation but the village in Bihar or something, or Kerala, then the national accounts are absolutely worthless. The model of the household is worthless because the household is not exchanging necessarily in market prices of anything. They are factories. Children are going out, getting water, finding cow dung for. So it's a hugely interesting subject, our subject, but we sort of are our worst enemy in not going about it. So those are not there. That's one class. We don't even have proper accounting for human capital. We think of expenditure, we think of the accumulation of human capital as consumption expenditure. But then you can't at the same time say it's a capital asset that you're accumulating. Should be investment, and so forth. So in a deep sense, and if we have time, question time, I'll try and explain to you why our notion of investment has to change if you take the theory seriously. Which you should, because the theory is correct. All right, so that's how I'm going to end now. We want to look at data. The period under study, by the way, things have happened since this work. The UNESCO now produces a biennial publication called the Inclusive Wealth Report, and that has much. So I'm going to be very brisk with this, and then I'll complete. This is 1995 to 2000. Reproducible capital, these have to be estimated. So stock in 1995 and stock in 2000. Human capital, education, that's pretty straightforward. Health. This is I'm going to leave it as a puzzle for you. We studied health has both instrumental and intrinsic worth. Instrumental is that you can produce more if you're healthy. That's the instrument. But also you feel better. And also we all like to live longer. That's a sort of universal fact. And so what we did was to look at increase in life expectancy, and you need to prove a theorem to show that life expectancy is the right measure of it. And you get this huge amount, 500,000. Natural capital, I won't bother you. It's a huge underestimate because most of these objects aren't available. We had only agricultural land, forest, and subsoil resources in mind. And if I take capital gains and carbon damage properly into account, then we found that 7 tells us that over this 5-year period, the growth rate of wealth per capita was 0.2% at a time when growth in GDP per capita was about 5-6%. So you can see how these things play out. I'll stop here because for question time, if you remember over institutional capital, I had an item called time. And you may have wondered what the heck that was doing. Well, it's picking up all the things that are exogenously changing over which the country has no control. And if they do, then of course your productive capacity changes. Think of total factor productivity growth. If you think that you can't explain it, you're smarter today than you were last year, not because God was nice to you, not because you did anything about it. Then the mere passage of time is helping. If you're an oil importing country and the price of oil goes up, then your wealth goes down because you're having to live on. That's the idea. And that's picked up in 8. There are problems with it, which I'll come to at question time. But what I wanted to give you was an idea that there is a way of measuring, estimating the means to what we are really after, which is cogent, coherent, and follows the rules of logic. And that's where our national income accounting and our entire accounting system should move, because our accounts should follow economics rather than economics follow the accounting. Thank you very much.